As Federal troops extended their occupation of Confederate states during the Civil War, slaves escaped their bondage and flooded behind Union lines to towns like Alexandria. Many came from nearby Fairfax, Fauquier, Loudoun, Prince William, and Culpeper counties, but their exact origins are unknown. These freedmen, or contrabands, sought freedom and refuge from slavery. Since they were still considered property, the slaves were labeled as contrabands in order to prevent them from being returned to their masters. This arrangement was beneficial to the Union because the contrabands could join the wartime workforce. Beginning in 1862, there was such an influx of contrabands that the town endured what had been described as a refugee crisis. According to one statistic, the population of Alexandria had exploded to 18,000 by the fall of 1863, an increase of 10,000 people in 16 months. When they arrived in Alexandria, some freedmen found employment and the opportunity for a new life. Some were provided with schools, hospitals, and housing. Some even fought in the war. Freedmen also encountered sickness, disease, and death due to horrible living conditions and poverty when they moved to Alexandria. They lived in barracks and shanty towns hastily assembled in order to handle the sudden rise in population. Smallpox and typhoid outbreaks were prevalent. It eventually became clear that existing graveyards were not sufficient to handle the increasing numbers of Alexandria freedmen who were dying due to these conditions. In January of 1864, the federal government seized property at the corner of South Washington and Church Streets in order to establish a burying ground specifically for the freedmen. Burial started in March of that year. The Freedmen's Cemetery is the final resting place of approximately 1,800 individuals. Over half of those buried at the cemetery are children under the age of 16. Due to a high infant mortality rate, this is typical of the period, and the quality of life endured by the contrabands. African American soldiers, otherwise known as colored troops, were also buried at the Freedmen's Cemetery. In December 1864, injured soldiers petitioned for the right to be buried at the Soldiers' Cemetery. They were granted the request. All troops buried at the Freedmen's Cemetery were disinterred and reburied at the Soldiers' Cemetery in 1865. Burials by the federal government at Freedmen's Cemetery ended in 1869, and the last time the burial ground appeared on a local map was in 1839. Ownership of the land changed hands several times in the mid-20th century, resulting in development of the property. A gas station, buried gas tanks, an office building, a brick factory, parking lots, and an interstate highway have had their effects on the cemetery site. Unfortunately, many graves were lost or disturbed. The full extent of the damage to the graves is still unknown.